probably no two bigger topics in the world of screen composing than how do I find work, and when I get that work, hooray, what do I charge? Figuring out how much to ask for on a gig, or whether something that someone has offered you is fair or not, and whether you should take it, is probably one of the questions that I get asked the most. So today I thought I'd take a little bit of time and offer some of my thoughts on tactics, techniques, ways of thinking, and things to put in your arsenal for the next time that you have to consider whether a gig is worth it, whether it's fair, whether it's good or bad, and or what you should put out there in terms of what you want to charge for any given gig. So the first thing to remember, I think, is there are no silver bullets. There's no one answer to this because every gig is different, every situation is different. Where you are in your career is going to dictate to a certain degree what you should take and what you should refuse, what's fair and what's not. Because if you're just starting out and you're working on a student feature, or a student short for that matter, you're not going to be commanding the same kind of cash as you would be if you were, working in Hollywood on a major blockbuster. I mean, it's sort of the same way you think about, you're in the backyard working on your own car, trying to figure out how the engine works, versus, being the team lead of mechanics on an F1 car for Ferrari. Two very different things. You can't really compare them in terms of value, in terms of what's fair and what's not. So speaking of value, I think that's where we need to start. I need to back it up a little bit before I answer the question of how much you should charge. And maybe that's not even the best question. Maybe the best question is, how do you think about what you should charge, or how do you think about the idea of value, right? So what is value? Cash in hand, $20 bill. It is in and of itself valueless. Like the actual money or the paper that has something printed on it is not valuable. Like it's a piece of paper. That's all it is. What has value is the fact that there is an agreement amongst people to say that I will give you, if you give me this $20 bill, I will give you goods of equal value as determined by a number of different factors. And that changes, right? The cost of an apple on any given day is not the cost of an apple. The cost of, a liter of gas is not the cost of a liter of gas forever and ever and never changing. Of course, this changes all the time. So the idea of what value is and how that works changes all the time. Money, cash, is not the only way to think about value in terms of goods and services, or services rendered and value coming back to you. There are a number of different ways to look at that. And again, throughout your career and in terms of what you're looking at, it's a good idea to get out of the habit of purely thinking about it in monetary terms only, because that's only one bucket, that's only one small way of thinking about how you can be fairly compensated for the work you're doing. Okay, so what are some things that are of value that are not monetary? Well, an amazing experience is valuable, right? So if you are afforded some kind of incredible experience by virtue of you're working on a project, that has value. The ability to go traveling for a project, the ability to work with an orchestra or work with musicians of any kind because that's built into your budget, that's a form of value. There are certain, and I know this is always a joke, the joke is that, exposure bucks, you're paid in exposure, and the joke is, of course, people die of exposure. Well, I've been thinking about this for a while, and I think it's actually kind of a poisonous idea because, certain types of exposure would be really valuable. As a kind of extreme example, imagine that Steven Spielberg set up this new foundation and he wanted to go out there and find the newest, freshest voices in composing. And there was somebody in your circle that knew Steven personally in some way or had access to him, and they said, look, I can't pay you what you're worth for this project, but if you do me this as a favor, I will introduce you to Steven and talk you up and do my best to try and get you into his program. That would be valuable exposure. I would take that in a heartbeat. I would even pay for that opportunity, to be honest with you. So, I think the idea of value and the way that we think about how we might be compensated for projects, we need to open up our minds a little bit more and realize that it's not just about the money all the time. That doesn't mean you don't need to be fairly compensated or that you shouldn't take yourself seriously and ask for money. Yes, of course, you should go for that. You should be compensated in some way for the work that you do. But it can vary greatly. Sometimes when you're just starting out, the ability, the access to even have a project to work on is the most valuable thing to you. If you've got nothing going on and 0 credits to your name and you just need to get some experience scoring something, then even just the opportunity to work on a student film is going to be worth it, and you will do it for nothing, or maybe just in terms of having your hard costs covered. you need good intelligence. In order to make good decisions, you need to have information, and you need to have certain things in your arsenal in order to be able to come into any kind of a situation with confidence. And I think that's really ultimately what most people stumble or have a difficult time with, is that they don't have adequate information going into a situation. That gives them fear and anxiety and inhibits them from making good decisions about certain things. In order to move forward, to make a good decision, or even to say something with confidence, like, this is the number that I'm going to quote to you. If you don't feel confident in that number, it may be because you don't have the background information to be able to say that confidently, to know this is fair based on these hard facts, or this kind of precedent, or this standard. So when you're approached by someone and they're talking about a new project, you need to know a certain number of things before you can even think about what a fair price for that would be, such as, who is it for? What's the project for? Something that you're going to be doing for Pepsi as a client is going to be vastly differently charged than something you're going to do for a local nonprofit. You need to know, what do they need? What kind of music is it? What are their actual requirements for music in this project? If someone comes to you and says, I have a feature film, can you do the music? And you go, sure. Well, okay, well, what kind of music is it? Is it dense, heavily orchestrated action music? Or is it long, wandering ambient music? Is it wall to wall? Is it like an hour and 20 minutes of pure score? Or is it like, we only need 20 minutes of music? What are your hard costs? Do you have to visit a studio and record things in studio, or you can do everything in your home? Are you going to be hiring live musicians, or are you going to be performing everything that's on the score yourself? So any kind of hard costs have to be considered, and those really have to be put at the forefront of anything you're doing. That whether you're doing an all-in budget where they're just giving you one big chunk of cash and saying you figure it all out, or if they're actually dividing the creative fee for you versus your hard costs on the other side, you still need to have a real sense of that in order to be able to give or come up with a fair number and go, okay, within this all-in budget, I know how to carve out that part that I need, and I know sort of where I need to make exceptions or concessions or whatever. What's the turnaround time? So do they need this yesterday? Is it absolutely like of utmost importance that it get done super fast? Because if that's the case, you're going to have to say no to all other work. You have to basically shut down everything else in your life, and it's increased stress and increased management and probably increased costs to you as well, because if you have to do things like hire copyists or hire orchestrators or anything else in order to get the job done on time, that's going to be an extra cost to you. What are the deal terms? So what do I mean by deal terms? These are things like, do they require you to hand over the keys to the kingdom, i.e. when you're done, you give them the IP, the intellectual property of that music, and say, this is now yours. You own it 100%. You can do whatever you want with it. I have no stake in this claim anymore. Is it that, or is it something else? Do they just need a license? And what kind of a license do they need? How long is the license going to be, and what is it going to be for? Is it just a festival license? Is it a 2-year license for all media? Is it a web-only license? There are many different ways to carve out these deals and to work with the numbers, and you have to know what you're actually playing with in order to be able to give them something that makes sense. The total production budget. This can be a kind of jumping off point for you. And again, it's scalable, right? So when you go to someone, you want to find out what the total production budget, you might say something like, well, in order to give you a good quote, or to be able to give you something that we think is fair and reasonable for the scope of what you're looking at, it would be helpful for me to know what your total production budget is for this. That way you can sort of look at it and go, well, okay, based on this, the standard has always kind of been 2.5 to roughly 5% of the total production budget might be spent on music. Now that might include music licensing, and that might include the total production music budget, including licensing and the hiring of musicians and studios and everything else as an all-in budget for you, which again changes that scale. That's something very important that you need to be aware of. One thing to keep in mind, of course, is that as you get to smaller and smaller scale production, the scale of that project gets so small, or the production budget of that project gets so small that, something like 2.5% of a total shooting budget of $1,000 doesn't really make sense. But it's a helpful sort of rule of thumb, a jumping off point. It's not a hard factor. It's just sort of something to keep in mind as maybe a sort of general thinking like, okay, it could be somewhere in this range. One of the most important bits of information you can probably have is knowledge of going rates, industry standards. If there's anything you can get your hands on that sort of gives you a glimpse into this, any kind of rate sheets, rates documents that your guild or association has produced, for instance, the Screen Composers Guild of Canada at screencomposers.ca has a wonderful rates document that was produced recently, and that is available for members on the member side of that website. If you go to the Australian Screen Composers site, and I'll link it down below, they have their rates rates posted publicly on the public side of their website. So you can get a good sense of what going rate for different types of productions at different levels is going to be. These are benchmark rates, so they're not standard. It is a range, and you can go way above and you can go way below, but it gives you a sense of what a sort of jumping off standard industry rate is. And this is again why network is so important. So the people that you know, the other composers that are within your circle, or even if you're belonging to one of these guilds or organizations, reach out to people. In general, I find that people are really easy to access. They're really willing to talk to you about these kinds of things, because in the end it actually does us all good. Charge more fairly, charge more accurately, not undercut necessarily, and just it gets us a better deal for everyone in the long run. And it gives you that confidence going in. If someone decides to throw a number at you that you don't feel is fair, you can cite that. You can say, well, I've actually talked to a number of composers in the field, and my sense is that this, generally speaking, in terms of a fair market price, lands around here. And for that reason, I'd love to see that number come up a little bit. One thing you definitely want to do for yourself is figure out what your ideal hourly rate is. And again, this is something that's going to change over your career. When you're starting out, you might be perfectly happy making 25 bucks an hour. And then later as you go on, that may rise considerably until you're approaching $100 an hour and even more. The reason why this is so helpful is that you can create for yourself a quick little Excel sheet document or anything else where you can calculate very quickly what you think you're going to be making on a certain project based on how much work there is. You have to know how quickly you can produce the work, including orchestration, including all the outputs, like what's the total number of hours. So you want to have a really good sense of that, and then you can build your hourly rate so that when somebody goes, well, we have, $15,000 for you, you can go, okay, well, based on $15,000 and 60 minutes of music and my ability to write 2.5 minutes of music a day and my rate being 50 bucks an hour, this is where we land, right? Can't do that kind of math in my head, never mind. I'm not going to tell you what the answer to that is, so it doesn't matter. But the point is, if you have that kind of a document and I have to rely on it just punching in the numbers, you can go, boom, it's within my target, or it's a little low, so I can push that number up, or, whatever else it's going to be, whatever sort of feels good. If you're sort of in that ballpark and you're feeling like, okay, this could work, then you're good to go. I always feel like whatever you say yes to, you should say yes to it wholeheartedly, knowing that you can go into the project and pursue it and give it 110%, under promise a little bit, over deliver, and just have a wonderful experience, because there's really no point in you saying yes to something where you're really just genuinely unhappy with the deal that you struck, because that's going to poison everything you do and it's never going to work out good for you. You're going to not enjoy the process of being creative and even probably find it challenging to be creative. It's just a bad scene all around. Don't do it. Finally, and this relates to the last thing I said, you have to know what your bottom line is, or what's known as a BATNA, a best alternative to a negotiated agreement. What is your walkaway terms, right? So what are you not willing to do? What is the point at which you say, you know what, this isn't worth it, and I'm going to politely decline this project? Because it may end up being that for all the reasons, including how good is the project, how badly do you need it, will it make wonderful music for your reel? Does it give you a chance to work with an orchestra, etc., etc., etc.? If all of those things don't equal something that you feel really great about and that meets that minimum threshold for, I'm good to go, let's get this baby going, let's put all burners on and go for it, you should walk, because you could be spending your time doing other valuable activities. And that's why it's called the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So what could you be doing? You could be working on your music. You could be improving yourself. You could be producing music for a library that you could license. You could be hunting for another gig that will get you a better deal that you'll be more happy with. So that kind of covers some of the basics of the information that you need in order to be able to either provide a quote to someone or to understand an offer that's been made to you. Think about what is valuable to you, and then to consider all the different aspects of the project in tandem and look at it in sort of a big picture way that sorts out all of the different information you're going to gather. And that's one of the most important and key critical points, is that you have to go out and do that information gathering thing, which means asking filmmakers questions like, what's your total shooting budget, and what is your what do you have a number in mind? That's a great thing to ask as well. If you don't have a number and they're sort of asking you to quote, it's like, well, do you have a ballpark idea of what you'd like this to look at? That can be very helpful. And all of those things in tandem give you a big picture. And with the information, especially the industry standard rates as your sort of jumping off point, that's how you're going to come up with those kind of numbers and be able to confidently say to someone, this is the number I'm thinking. How does that sound to you? All right, that was a lot of information in a very short amount of time, but I hope it was helpful. I hope it gets you going, gets you started, and gives you a bit of a baseline to jump off from, and a feeling of better confidence about quoting numbers and having a good reason for stating the number that you're going to state, or just thinking about the idea of value in general. If you have any questions or concerns, or even if you disagree with something I'd said, I'd love to hear from you guys and respond to that in a future video maybe. As always, if you liked the video, please give me a like, give me that thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed already, I'd love it if you did, and we'll see you guys in the next one.